Right, welcome everybody. My name is Kate Macdonald. I run Handheld Press, and we tomorrow will be publishing this lovely wee volume, The Unknown by Algernon Blackwood. And we are with today Henry Bartholomew, who is the editor of that volume, that anthology. And Henry and I are going to have a conversation, and after about 30 minutes or whenever my questions run out, we will throw the floor open to questions. So if you have questions, scribble them down, and then you can have a chat and a conversation after that. So Henry, you are formerly University of Plymouth, now you're a lecturer at University of Liverpool, about to go to Xianjiaotong in China, University in China, when the paperwork is done.
Yep.
You are a Blackwood specialist. Can you tell us more about why Blackwood? How does Blackwood fit in
into my life?
Research does?
Yeah, absolutely. So Blackwood, I came across Blackwood. Blackwood was put into my path, actually. I was working on my PhD, which is on ghost stories, and a meeting with one of my supervisors. I was wanting to think about issues of ecology, nature, that sort of thing, and he recommended I read some Blackwood, and he pulled the book off his shelf, which I actually still have, and never gave back to him. And that book actually doesn't contain any stories about Blackwood's nature writing at all. It's called The Whisperers. It's about the books. But that started a kind of journey that led me to discovering more, and then to a volume called Pan's Garden, which was Blackwood's fifth story collection and one of the most popular, certainly now. And out of that grew a kind of whole chapter of my thesis. So I think from about 2017, I've been kind of thinking about Blackwood, writing about Blackwood, occasionally dreaming about Blackwood, and collecting Blackwood as well. So I have a lot of his books, first editions of his books as well, in an attempt to try and kind of get a sense of his entire oeuvre. I mean, he wrote an awful lot, over 200 short stories, a dozen novels, lots of children's books as well later in his career. And there's a whole kind of immaterial aspect of Blackwood's work, which is all his radio programs and television programs. So he kind of progressed into different media later in his life, and all that material is basically lost now. So there's a whole kind of aspect of Blackwood's life and career which we don't have access to anymore, which is kind of a bit sad. But we do have all these books. So I mean, that's kind of where my research has been based, and particularly his supernatural fiction.
Mm-hmm. So have you done scouring of newspapers and magazines to try and rediscover stories that might have been overlooked?
I have, and I thought I found one, but it turned out it had been republished 3 years prior to my discovery, which is a story called The Lock of Grey Hair. And I did find that in an old newspaper, a digital archive that I was looking through. But yeah, it turned out it had already been republished. But it's a really great story. It should be more widely known. I don't know why Blackwood didn't anthologize it. It was written during the time that he was publishing other story collections, so I don't know why it's not included. It was very good. I mean, sometimes I think he just forgets things, forgets what he's written and where he's placed things.
Yeah. Was he very prolific? I mean, what quantity are you talking about?
Kind of. He certainly produced a lot over the course of his lifetime. I mean, he starts quite late. He starts writing at 37.
And what period is that?
Right before it. That's in 1906 is his first book.
Right.
And his final book, The Doll and One Other, is published in 1946, and he dies in 1951. So I mean, he's writing sort of 40 years or so, doing lots of other sort of side bits, and then of course the television and radio as well. So I mean, he writes a lot in that time. He does slow down in the latter half of his life, and mainly in the tail end of the last kind of 10, 20 years, it's mainly just children's fiction and the TV and the radio. But all of his children's stories usually have a kind of, not all of them, but many of them have a kind of philosophical quality. You know, he's always thinking in terms of that. So he writes a book called Dudley and Gilderoy, which is about like the friendship between a cat and a parrot. It's really this kind of philosophical meditation on friendship and animals and things like that. But it also has the kind of surface element of just being a fun story about the adventures of a cat and a parrot. But there's lots of things like that.
Yeah. And the The radio work for the BBC, is there any trace of that? I mean, have you gone to the archives that
Yeah,
cover it?
there is, and there's actually something new. I think the British Library have just kind of released more or improved their access to certain kinds of their sonic materials, their recorded materials. And I think there are some Blackwood things in there. Um, there are also a few scripts for his radio stuff. I mean, some of it was him reading stories, and there are some scripts left over from that. And some of those were published. So, I mean, he's a great author that was anthologized in his own lifetime, heavily anthologized.
Yeah.
So I have a book somewhere up there which is about it's called Best British Broadcast Stories, published during, I think, the Second World War. And one of Blackwood's stories is in there. It's a rewrite of an earlier story. I can't remember the name now. And that's kind of an example of work that he transferred into the radio material. So we have that kind of evidence of his radio stuff, some scripts and some publications. But to be honest, I haven't done a deep dive into that kind of material in the archives yet. I've done some of his letters, which was very illuminating.
It's possible that Mike Ashley, who wrote the biography of Blackwood and who is an enormously knowledgeable man for this genre, he may already have done some research because he has access to so many periodical resources of his own. Yeah.
Yeah, I expect he probably has. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that he talks about in terms of Blackwood's radio career, the biography, I think he does mention various scripts and so forth. So I think he's probably got more on it than I have.
Probably in there. But why did Blackwood write? Was it for fun, or was it for money, or a combination of both?
Money, certainly. As he says in the essay, one of the essays that we've included in the book on the genesis of ideas, he writes to relieve an emotion, is the way he expresses it. So he has emotional reactions to his world, the environment, and they kind of sit with him and bubble up in his subconscious. You know, he's an early reader of Freud and Jung. He's thinking in kind of psychoanalytical terms, one of the early writers to do so. And yeah, these come out in lots of interesting ways.
Yeah. Well, for our anthology, we divided the works into 4 sections, and I cannot now remember if it was your idea or my idea to do this.
I think it's a bit of both. So when I first pitched the book to you, it was for The Human Chord, one of his novels.
Yeah, and I didn't like it.
Which is a shame. And it's a book that hopefully someone will reprint somewhere.
I don't know. I think The Human Chord is a short story that's been stretched out way beyond the end of its natural life. It's just attenuated beyond reason, and
that happens with several Blackwood stories, and certainly contemporary reviewers thought that about some of his work as well. A lot of it was overly long. He tends to belabor a point. I think he kind of circles around feelings, and in doing so, he kind of overwrites stories in that regard. So I mean, he is, to me, a much better short story writer than novelist.
Yeah.
Which is interesting that his novels were published by Macmillan, which were very successful, very
and prestigious,
highly regarded, prestigious publishing venue, even in, you know, especially in the 19th century, but even in the 20th century. So there was obviously some regard. Someone at Macmillan thought he was a fantastic writer.
Yeah. And they must have sold, because he wouldn't have kept publishing him if he hadn't some money back.
Yeah, I mean, multiple collections. His only short story collection for Macmillan were the 2 were Pan's Garden and Incredible Adventures, I think.
Okay. So once I'd rejected The Human Chord, I think you must come back saying, well, how about short stories?
Yes, yeah. I think you suggested a volume of short stories, which I thought was fantastic. And then I compiled a list of what I thought were some of the rarer stories that you don't see reprinted. And then I sent that to my contact at the British Library, because I knew that they were bringing out a Blackwood book as well, The Whisperers, Mike Ashley's.
That's right.
And saw that a lot of the stories overlapped, so I got kind of sneaky pre-access to the stories they were going to publish. And I thought, well, I don't want to, our book to have the same stories in, so we rethought it, and it was you suggested that if there's any non-fiction that we could. Yeah, so the idea was then to combine non-fiction pieces with the stories in a kind of way that was really thematic. So it wasn't just here's a kind of load of non-fiction kind of crowbarred in at the end. We wanted, I kind of tailored it specifically so that these pieces would hopefully shine a kind of light on the stories themselves. So it's a difficult line to walk, because, you know, as a kind of literature scholar, it's kind of criticism 101 is that you don't confuse the narrator with the author. But with Blackwood, it's kind of really difficult. He's so autobiographical and admits that all the stories are autobiographical, that it's very difficult to kind of, I mean, you have to really draw yourself back away from that position of saying, okay, this is Blackwood in these stories. He's this 40-year-old mystic living in London doing these things, and like, well, that was Blackwood, you know, at that time. So so I think there is that kind of tension, but I'm hoping that readers will see those kinds of connections, and it's not to forced kind of biographical reading.
Well, the structure of the book is we have the 4 sections. So they're Canada, Mountain, Reincarnation, and Imagination. And each section has a piece of non-fiction, which is quite often autobiographical writing, and then 2 short stories which are paired with that non-fiction to support what Blackwood says in his own voice, as well as to contrast. For the Canada one, how many years was Blackwood in Canada? Can you remember?
So he visits first in 1887 with his father, Sir Stevenson Arthur Blackwood, and they do a kind of tour, quite a large tour for the time, because his father wanted to see that the new Canadian Pacific Railway, how that was working. So he worked for the post office at the time. Visit tracts of lands. He was also an evangelical preacher, so he was giving lots of kind of talks and meeting lots of people and that sort of thing. But they came back that year, and then Blackwood went to university in Edinburgh for a few years. Didn't finish his degree. I decided he wanted to go back to Canada, and moved to Toronto. So I think that was 1888.
Okay.
89, something like that. And he wanted to be a farmer. I mean, we could have had a very different Blackwood, in that he studied agriculture at Edinburgh, and he went to Toronto to work as a dairy farmer. But bizarrely, I think Ashley explains it in his biography of Blackwood, that the milk kept turning sour. I don't know why, they couldn't explain it. And so they lost all their money. They lost all the milk and lost all the money, and eventually that led Blackwood to New York and to journalism. But we could have had a Blackwood that that became a successful dairy farmer in Canada, and we've had a very different trajectory with that. And then weirdly, when he came back to London in 1899, before his first book, he was working in the dried milk business. So there's obviously a weird kind of dairy thing going on there. Maybe he thought he'd have more luck with the dried milk than the fresh milk. But
who can tell? But when did he begin writing about Canada? Was it when he was there, or did he wait till he came back and then thought he might use that?
I think it starts when he comes back. I'd have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that the only fiction that he writes that's published, at least, starts maybe 1898, 1899. I think Haunted Island is one of his first Canada stories. And I think that's 1898, I think, something. So just before he comes back. But most of his stories are from after he returns from Canada. So a lot of them he's writing back. I mean, something like The Wendigo, I think, is 1907, is it?
Can you explain The Wendigo? Because actually I've never read it, so I was a bit startled when I read, you said it's one of the most famous works by Blackwood, and it's just one I've never come across. But
yeah, it's that and The Willows are kind of his most well known. It's a story about a group of people going hunting in the kind of Canadian wilds, and one of the characters encountering this kind of spirit, and it's very creepy, strange, uncanny, and the story also kind of falls into horror. Like, it's very horrifying as well, and that kind of classic Blackwood, where it's the kind of numinous meets the terrifying. And yeah, it's kind of explained that it's this kind of spirit of the woods, which is another one of Blackwood's favorite themes, kind of nature spirits. But this one is tied specifically to this Canadian legend of the Wendigo. Yeah. It's a good story. One of his longer ones. Some aspects of it are dated now. I think some language particularly.
And
yeah,
that was a big success for him then, was it? How come that one has lasted? Is it just
I think it's what people's imagination. I mean, it's just genuinely creepy. I think you read a lot of these older stories, certainly ones that are classed as classic horror stories. And as modern audience, it can be difficult to find the actual horror in them. I think a story like the Wendigo and the Willows, they still produce a kind of a chill, a shudder.
Yeah. The Willows is very scary. We published that in British Weird, our anthology of 2 years ago, I think now.
Yeah.
Very long story as well. It
is, yes, yeah. And another one based on an actual journey that Blackwood took down the Danube, a friend. So I mean, I think I pitched that to you as well, because he wrote it up, so that could have been a pairing in this book, that ghost pairing, but yeah, it's not to reprint these stories. So
well, if in the Canada section we've got Blackwood writing about moose hunting or moose shooting, and then we have a story about. Do we have a story? Yes, we do. We have a story about the murder that's committed while moose shooting. And the two pieces of writing are really interchangeable. It's hard for me now, because I don't know them well. I've read them both a couple of times. It's hard for me now to pick out an episode and work out which was it in the narrative nonfiction or was it in the invented story.
Yeah. I think that's the same with in the mountains, the Winter Alps piece. It's almost a kind of mood piece, just the Mid the Haunts of the Moose. Yeah, really early 1900.
Yeah.
That's just when he's back in the UK. He's kind of reflecting on his experiences in Canada.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of got adventure elements meets with this kind of poetry of Labrador and these spaces he's been in Canada. And then paired with the story, which I love, and it's not a supernatural story. It's a kind of
it's
creepy,
still scary though. It's
unnerving. It's a kind of the darker sides of the human psychology, and just I think Blackwood has such a good understanding of human psychology and how that can be kind of ratcheted to produce really grim feeling sensations. And that's such a good example of that stuff.
And the small details of what it's like when you are camping, and the idea of proximity to other white men. They're 50 miles away, so they're too close. And that gives you a sense of the countryside as well, but the vast scale of the land.
Yeah.
And then the other Canada story we have is The Wolves of God, which I thought was very good. And then I started writing the notes for it, and I was absolutely horrified because I don't know if Blackwood ever went to Orkney, but his topography is completely wrong, because he describes one of the islands in Orkney where most of the action takes place in terms of it being a Yorkshire moor, a shooting moor. It's as if he's never been there, but I'm now not quite sure if he ever did get. Anyway, I was shocked.
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I think I chose it because there are lots of other stories that more obviously tied to his experiences in Canada, but they're much more well known. This is a story that's hardly ever been republished, so I thought it'd be a good candidate for this book.
And it is directly related to his Canadian experience. It just happens to take place in Orkney.
It's about that kind of reflection from back, away from Canada, and those kinds of legacies, the lingering experiences. And also, Blackwood, he's very imaginative. He uses this material to kind of create these speculative experiences. And yeah, I mean, in terms of whether he certainly visited Scotland, went to University of Edinburgh, and traveled around a bit. I don't know if he went to Orkney, but he tended not to write about places he hadn't been to.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't know. I don't think there's any evidence that he went to Orkney, so I wouldn't like to
No,
say.
I think he talks about the trees and the woods, and there are no trees and
But
woods.
no, he says there's no trees and woods, and that's what he likes about Orkney.
All right then.
There's no place for the wolves to hide behind, you see.
Okay, I will stop laying into Blackwood.
It's my job to defend him.
You mentioned the mountain section, which is the next section in the book. Who else writes supernatural stories about mountaineering? I mean, who can we compare Blackwood to? I think the mountain stories are the most effective of the entire anthology. I think it's outstanding. But I was struggling to think, well, who else writes about climbing in the same way?
Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Yeah, they're two really. I mean, and he writes a lot because he lives in Switzerland
Mhm.
for a long time. He loves the Alps. He loves hiking,
Yeah.
walking, mountaineering, skiing. He's a very early skier.
Mm.
You know, really in the first decade of the 20th century, he's skiing
Yeah.
and writing articles. He's part of that kind of popularization of skiing as a pastime for the kind of European cosmopolitan that wants to travel, wants to see Europe, and can go skiing as well. You know.
Yeah. He's about a decade, 15 years earlier than Dorothy Richardson in one of her pilgrimage novels, and I've forgotten which. I think it might be March Moonlight, but I'm not sure. And also one of the books we published a couple of years ago, biography of Valentine Ackland. There's photographs of her skiing in the late 20s, and
Yeah.
she too was a very adept skier, although I don't think she indulged in it too long.
Yeah. Well, she may have read Blackwood's article in Country Life.
It is faintly possible, though she was communist. She may not have subscribed. But
That's true. There's some interest on weird mountain stuff at the moment,
mm.
but I just, off the top of my head, I can't think of any other stories. Blackwood, he did write several.
Yeah.
And I did cycle through a few of them. I think I sent quite a few to you as well when we were thinking about these pairings.
Yeah.
But The Glamour of the Snow White is just one of Blackwood's great stories.
It's amazing.
And there is just something really shivery about that story. You kind of feel the ice, you know. You talk about the chill down the spine. I mean, it's kind of
It's in brief, to those who may not know it, it's about a man who goes skating at night in a Swiss resort and meets a beautiful woman who can skate as fast as he can and as strongly, and he falls in love and tries to follow her up the mountain. And she's not who he thinks she might be, and it's absolutely terrifying. And you have to read every word very carefully to be sure that you think you know what's going on. It's
yeah. It's got quite a thrilling end as well. It's kind of actiony.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Which is a little unusual. Sometimes Blackwood stories end kind of metaphysically, whereas this one ends with a more kind of bit of a chase.
It's absolutely a thrill. Yeah. And then we have The Sacrifice. The Sacrifice is the other short story. It's set in the mountains. That really is metaphysical.
Yes.
It's full of, in fact, it's very Lovecraftian, I'd say. It's like Lovecraft in the snow, and I found it wonderful. It's a terrific story.
Yeah, I think this is a story that I mean, it was published originally in a kind of esoteric magazine, periodical, and it's pitched for an audience that's interested in those kinds of, that kind of sense of the self as a spiritual entity, but not in the kind of orthodox Christian way. The story is about this man, Limmerson. A series of financial personal blows strike him, and instead of kind of hanging around in London and sort of dealing with that fallout with society, he continues on his planned hiking trip in the mountains, and it's sort of about his losing faith in his gods, and this is gods plural, so this is a kind of paganism he has. Though we're not told who these particular gods are, it's kind of left that very personal relationship between the hiker and the mountains. But the gods are kind of passing, and he goes hiking, and there's two other people that hike with him, and I won't spoil it, but it's a kind of there's lots of symbolism. There's lots about that kind of that journey to divinity, and like sort of that move upwards and the struggle, the sacrifice involved in that.
there's a terrific moment of dislocation of scale. I still don't know how Blackwood does it, but he gives a real sense of alien entities or pagan entities you're in the presence of, and it's very,
Yes.
very effective.
Yeah, something other, something
Other.
beyond human ken is kind of intervening in the world. You mean you get it in a much more kind of horrific fashion in The Willows.
Yes.
But this is a more kind of, it's more subdued, but in many ways it's kind of more meaningful. You can see that it's incredibly meaningful to Blackwood kind of writing it.
Yeah.
If we make that slippage between narrator and author, which I can't help but doing in the case of Blackwood,
Yeah.
it feels very real in that
Mm.
regard. And it's just a beautifully written story. I mean, we talk about Blackwood's prose. He has this kind of elusive style that is the language is very kind of lofty and enticing. And then it kind of counters and it will be very strict. So he like has this trick where he will write something and then he'll kind of repeat himself, but in just a few words as a very short sentence.
Yeah.
And it's really effective as a kind of writing strategy. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't fully got around to figuring out how best to express that because I've been trying to write it as well in my academic work. But yeah, there's something about the way he writes I think is really powerful, and in this story in particular, it's really on show.
Yeah, yes, it does feel personal. It does feel as though he's working out an essential experience that he's either imagined or he may have even felt he had himself, but it's transmuted really effectively. It's a really good story. Staying with esoterics, the next section in the book is reincarnation. And this is where I was extremely dubious. But it's fine. You sent me pieces I was willing to accept were actually really very good. The Insanity of Jones is a horrific story, and it's based on the premise of reincarnation and what you do if you feel you have been reincarnated and you've met someone who's been nasty to you in a previous life. And then what do you do? What's the logical outcome? And I do love a story with a logical outcome. Put the character in position X, and what does X do?
Yeah, you just kind of see where it's going to go.
Yeah, and it's good. So it's not so much what's going to happen as no, how is it going to happen?
Yeah.
And that's the different. When I used to teach literature, that is how I used to describe the difference between horror and basically thrillers, because horror is much more interested in how the victim dies, whereas thrillers are what's going to happen at the end. Are they going to die? Yeah. This is a horror story.
Yeah,
undeniably horrible. So what was the basis of, I mean, I know you, in your introduction, you say that when Blackwood was an adolescent, he discovered a book of esoteric writings from the Hindu tradition. Is that right? And he was very attracted to it, and he was devoted to this feeling, to this ideology, if you like. So how did he move towards reincarnation as a life belief?
It's a really interesting one. I mean, he's raised in a really strictly evangelical family, Christian, and you know they go around. People come around to the house and they shake hands and say, "Are you saved? Are you saved?" And Blackwood describes as being, a very odd childhood, but he knew nothing else, and he was kind of separated from the kind of experiences that youth might have. He says when he arrives in Canada, he is like the most naive person, and he freely admits this. With that hindsight, he didn't know what the hell he was doing or what life was or anything like that. But yeah, he discovers this book, Patanjali's aphorisms, yoga aphorisms, that's left by a visiting evangelical who's reading it in order to write a tract against it as this kind of invasion of Eastern teachings in England. And he loves it. He reads it twice the same night by candlelight, and it kind of changes his outlook. And he gradually finds other texts and the idea of reincarnation, that you could sow what you reap, that you could kind of act now to change your future, he finds really compelling. And he writes about it in different places, and this feeds into his kind of esoteric experiences. So he joins various societies, the Theosophical Society, run by Helena Blavatsky, set up in 1885, I think. and also the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which is kind of, you know, the big Victorian esoteric society. And yeah, a lot of those teachings and those schools of thought are influenced by reincarnation. But as he gets older, he kind of wanes in his interest, or at least his belief. He comes to kind of challenge or temper his previous standing. So instead of buying into it wholeheartedly, he kind of draws back a little on the theme, and he starts wondering, you know, what if one could remember all one's past lives, that wouldn't be a good thing. It would be you know, terrible. And that's sort of what The Insanity of Jones is a kind of meditation on, I suppose, is what do you do with this information? If someone has wronged you egregiously in a past life, what do you do with the weight of that knowledge? And in the story, the character Jones is actually given a choice. You know, does he want to mete out justice, karmic justice, or does he want to rise to the level of a great forgiveness? And you can probably imagine which one he chooses by the way we talked at the beginning. But it's interesting, you know, Blackwood, he's not falling on one side or the other with this. I think there's a kind of agnosticism is the way I describe it in the introduction. That's true. I think he's not sure. And you know, the reader is left to imagine at the end of this story. It's called The Insanity of Jones, a study in reincarnation. And we have to decide as the reader if he's insane or not, right? Because if reincarnation is true or real, then Jones is acting in a kind of, you know, quasi correct way, right? There is a kind of justice to it, but if he's just mad, then this is just horrifying. Right?
Yeah.
So it's
a very it's an unsettling story.
Yes.
Because yes, there are reasons. Yes. And then the last one we have is imagination, which is, I think, the section where Blackwood is a teacher. Blackwood is saying, this is how I write. This is how imagination works for me. And that piece, that non-fictional piece, was taken from a magazine interview where he was explicitly being asked, what advice can you give to other writers? And was that something he did very often? My impression is that wasn't the case.
No. So, I mean, there's the bit that I quote in the introduction, which is from a book by someone Hoffman, can't remember the first name, which is Fiction Writers on Fiction Writing, where he asks a series of authors, you know, how do they write? Can they give any tips or tricks to aspiring writers? And Blackwood's one of those authors, yeah, and that's when he talks about emotion as being the kind of base of all his stories. He doesn't write unless he feels that kind of thing. He also writes somewhere else about you can't write a ghost story unless you're in a ghostly mood. So I think these kinds of things like emotion, mood, feeling, affect, they're really important in the process. And the piece we chose, the Genesis of Ideas, is really a kind of longer meditation on that process. How exactly does he come up with his ideas for writing? And he talks about emotion and it sort of coming back. So the return of the repressed, you know, to use that Freudian language, I think is very much part of how Blackwood sees it, you know, in his own self and how he writes about it. And that's what that first story is, Imagination, in the collection. About that, how to dramatize that sense of an emotion kind of taking shape and taking form. And that
completely takes you by surprise. And a very strange visitor arrives, which is a metaphorical realization of inspiration. Yes, it's a strange
meta story.
But it works. Okay, I think we might now open up questions to anyone who might be listening. Let me look at the gallery again. So if is anyone out there who'd like to ask any questions to Henry? Frank, please unmute yourself.
And I don't know where I got this quotation from, so unfortunately I can't give a reference. But it goes like this, that Algernon Blackwood said, there's a very thin film between our world and the world of the gods. And when that film breaks, consequences happen. Have you ever heard of that one?
I haven't heard that exact quote, no, but it strikes me as very Blackwoodian.
I've heard of
Yeah.
it, but in a slightly different form, because John Buchan said there's a very thin line between civilization and anarchy. And if the line is broken, if the line is breached, then you let loose the fires of hell. And he wrote that in a short story about 1900, I think. And I've temporarily forgotten the name of the story, but it was in the collection, The Watcher by the Threshold and Other Stories. And that was a theme that Buchan used a lot. But given that he and Blackwood were contemporary, I think Blackwood might have been about 10 years older.
Yeah. And the
Maybe
other
the
thing,
preoccupation of the period.
so I don't know whether this comes together or not, because I know Yeats was a member of the Golden Dawn Society. Would I mean, have I got it wrong, chronology wrong, or would Yeats have actually met Algernon Blackwood at any point, possibly?
Yeah, it was Yeats that introduced him to the Golden Dawn.
Oh,
Yes.
interesting. Oh,
Yeah,
good.
and that's where he met Arthur Machen as well, and various other secret members of the
And,
secret
and finally, just one other question, and then I'll stop. The Golden Fly, was that set in Switzerland? It's one of my favorite stories. A very, very. It wasn't didn't end. It's a very mystical story. Was that set in Switzerland? I know it's set in the mountains somewhere, but I don't know where.
The Golden Fly, I think it's in Pan's Garden, and I think in my mind it's in a forest in England somewhere.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
But I may be, because it's in Pan's Garden, and when I think of Pan's Garden, I think of The Man Whom the Trees Loved, which is set in the New Forest. And maybe I'm just kind of projecting that all the stories in that volume are set in the New Forest, and they're probably not. I'd have to go back and read that, but I think
I came across it in an anthology, Algernon Blackwood's Tales of the Supernatural, I think it's called. That before The Man Who the Trees Loved. But it's a great. I mean, I like it because it's a story anybody could read that's feeling down and troubled. It's such a marvelous story, and in a sense, not typically Blackwoodian at all. It doesn't end in horror or
no, no, it's quite an uplifting story, isn't it?
Yeah, very.
It's one of those stories that doesn't really have a plot. It's essentially about a man who walks into a forest somewhere and accidentally spots a fly, and then has a kind of mystical realization that he's very small in the world, and the world is this very large thing, and he's kind of down and out and depressed. I think he's suicidal as well.
Yeah.
Then he kind of has this revelation, and it changes his outlook. I mean, it's something that happens so often in Blackwood stories, is that kind of twist, how to find beauty in the world, beauty with a capital B. And that these are kind of not, I say religious, but kind of spiritual experiences for him. I mean, Blackwood's is he has this kind of what we would what secular modernity would describe as very kind of childish view, that the kind of changes that you make in your mind kind of manifest externally in the real world, and that you can kind of I mean, it's not kind of visualization, but his stories are all about that strange alchemy between psychology and reality. You know, what is real? What's in the mind? Does the mind create reality in a certain way? You know, I'm not going to say that Blackwood's a philosophical idealist, but he did read Hegel. You know, he thought that Hegel had some crazy mystical experience and then written The Phenomenology of Spirit. So I mean, there is that element to his way of thinking. I mean, just to touch on the question of suicide, this is something that Blackwood writes about a lot. It turns up in a lot of his stories, and I don't want to again project anything to Blackwood's life, because I don't know, and I don't believe that he had any kind of depression or anything like that. It's possible that he did at times, but certainly his later stories. You take a collection like Shocks, which is 1935, which is one of his last substantial collection of short stories, and I think four or five stories in there concern suicide. You know, and it's but it goes back to his first collection, The Empty House, 1906. The Story with Intent to Steal is about suicide as well. So I mean, it's there throughout his career, and I think he certainly knew at least one person that committed suicide, which was, as I mentioned in the introduction, a chap called Angus Hamilton, who was the man that took Blackwood's stories, first took them and sent them to Everly Nash, the publisher, and started his whole writing career. Without Angus Hamilton, we wouldn't have the Blackwood that we have today, and Hamilton later committed suicide. So I mean, it's there throughout his kind of consciousness, certainly, because it comes up again and again.
We have a question from Boyata number 20. Does Blackwood's mountain work predate the Bergfilmer movement or genre? I don't know what the Bergfilmer movement is. Do you, Henry?
No.
Okay, we need a date. Boyata, can you give us a date? You can unmute yourself if you like. Maybe that we'll come back to that one.
We'll do a quick Google.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Yes. What children's books do you write, and what were the genre for that?
Yeah, I mean, he wrote several. So they kind of take two forms. They're like sort of full-length novels, and then these kind of very short tales. And I mentioned Dudley and Gilderoy at the beginning, which is about a parrot and a cat and their relationships and adventures. He also writes a story called Maria and the something. It's on the shelf. It's called The Fruit Stoner, or The Fruit Stoners. And I say Maria because he wrote a shorter version called Maria and the Fruit Stoners. So he sometimes reuses titles and ideas and then fleshes them out in more detail. But those are his kind of two major children's stories. And then he wrote a series of, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 12, 13, 14, 15, looking at the shelf, much shorter children's stories, just at kind of 10 pages or so. And these range from a story like The Italian Conjurer, about an Italian magician in a house, to stories about the policeman, an underground railway, subway that takes you to a kind of magical realm, things like this. I mean, very inventive stories that he works on. And they originally appeared in these really lovely, sumptuous volumes called Joy Street, and the kind of number 20 Joy Street, number 21 Joy Street, which are anthologies for children, printed at great expense. These would have been for middle-class, well-off families.
Who were they published by, Henry?
Good question.
Is it Thomas Nelson? Because they were big on children's.
These sorts of, they're kind of filled with
Gosh.
wonderful illustrations. And you find all sorts of authors in here as well. You get a lot of Lord Dunsany, Arthur Machen, Dr. Mackenzie, Basil Blackwood.
Basil Blackwood. Okay.
Basil Blackwell.
Okay.
Blackwell's, yeah.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah, that's tradition of Oxford children's publishing. Yeah.
They were first published like that, and then they were published individually in these kind of small one-offs with sort of little images extracted from the original publication. So they're quite difficult to track down, these. But they're really wonderful stories. I mean, the thing with his earlier fiction is that a book like The Education of Uncle Paul or Jimbo, which are two of his earliest novels, 1909, I think a lot of people thought that they're about children. So I think people think that they're children's stories, but they're kind of for adults, about childhood. I think that Blackwood's really interested in that sense of wonder or imagination that comes with childhood. I mean, a lot of his short stories also are about trying to recapture that kind of wonder that children have. I mean, he's kind of romantic with a capital R in this way, almost Wordsworthy, in the kind of innocence of childhood, and that their view on the world is something that modernity and civilization crushes underfoot, really. And certainly he never married, he never had children, but he was a great favorite of children. So he had lots of friends that he would visit and stay with them, and he'd tell stories. He was a great raconteur. and he would kind of entertain of an evening, and children loved him, particularly someone like Hilaire Belloc, the writer and caricaturist. His daughter was a great fan of Blackwood, and she wrote about him later in life, and the way that he used to kind of play with them and create imaginary worlds at the bottom of the garden and things like that. So I think it was a natural progression for him to actually turn to writing children's stories proper, as opposed to writing about childhood for adults, if that makes sense.
Let's go back to Boyate's question. He says that the Bergfilmer movement was German films in the 1920s. So when was Blackwood writing his mountain supernatural stories?
Before that, yes. Yeah. I think The Glamour of the Snow is 1911, published, reprinted in Pan's Garden 1912. And The Sacrifice, that's a test. Luckily, we put all the bibliographic.
You did the research; it's all down there in the volume.
Book. Yeah. So The Sacrifice was originally published in The Quest, 1913. So 1913, these two stories.
Yeah.
And he writes about mountains later than that. He also wrote a really weird and not very good story called The Story of Karl Ott in the 19th century. It was his first story, or his second story, I think, after The Mysterious House. And that's set in the mountains as well, but it's kind of just about a creepy guy who's preying on a woman that doesn't really want to be with him. And then he pushes her off a cliff and then jumps off himself. So it's
very nihilistic.
It's not great.
Was he a member of the Alpine Club, as a matter of interest?
I don't know, but I think he mentions the Alpine Club in one of the stories, so he's certainly aware of it if he's not a member. He might have seen himself as being above it. I don't know.
More of a free climber than an alpinist. Okay. We have a question from Claire. Could we talk a little more about Blackwood's radio work?
Sure. Yeah. So he progresses from writing to radio. I think the first time he's invited to talk, he doesn't enjoy it very much, and he just does the one, and then doesn't come back to it for several years. But he is asked to read a ghost story, and he reads the ghost story, and that's really what he does when he takes on this radio work in the 30s and 40s. And yeah, I mean, it's mainly just telling ghost stories. There's a few in Black and Ashley's biography. He does talk about a few odd kind of shows he's going on. He does talk about other things that he had to do, like non-fiction pieces that he read. He also tells of a horrifying account, because obviously radio was all live, most of it, of a kind of quiz show he was on where they had children asking questions, and apparently they asked some really probing questions, and he kind of floundered to answer these properly. So I think but mainly it's his fiction pieces that he was writing, and as I was saying at the very beginning, he kind of adapts lots of stories he's already written in new ways. They have to be much shorter and punchier for the radio, so they tend to be kind of much more condensed. But I mean, as I say, there's much more work to be done, I think, on Blackwood's radio work, and those stories there. But he was hugely popular. He did also mainly BBC and the World Service. So, I mean, he had a large audience.
He was on the first television broadcast too, he said.
He was. So, so he made that transition at Alexandra Palace, 19 something.
36, I think, was in the book. Yeah.
It's in the book, yeah. Yeah, the first TV broadcast in this country. He takes part in it, and then becomes a kind of a feature, telling stories. He becomes known as the Ghost Man. A title that he doesn't like. He writes later in an introduction to one of his collected editions, I think it's the 1938 one, that he can finally repudiate the title of Ghost Man, because it's a title that's been thrust upon him, but he sees his own fiction more as about the expansion of human consciousness, of human faculty, that there's more to us, more to reality than the kind of humdrum world that we encounter. And his stories are about the kind of everyman, the man on the street, is the way Blackwood describes it, having these kinds of experiences. It's not a kind of, although Blackwood's a member of these secret societies, for him, it's about you know, everyone has this ability. It's not a kind of elite for him. And I think that's really, really important. And you see it again and again in his stories. It's this kind of democratic democratization of beauty and extension of human consciousness. But that's what he wanted. I mean, that didn't really pan out in his TV work. I mean, he does just tell kind of stories. Some of them aren't supernatural as well. And I mean, there were at least 2 stories that you could still watch on YouTube of him reading stories. One of them is called The Reformation of St. Jules. And I can't remember the other one. I think it might only be The Reformation that's still on YouTube somewhere, on the internet somewhere. But Blackwood's very elderly by that point. I mean, I think you can still, he kind of loses his place a bit. He smokes because, of course, you kind of light up a cigarette whilst you're talking in the middle of it. And there's a few kind of jerky cutscenes where he moves around the room. But you can get the sense of just how amazing a storyteller he must have been in his prime, you know, because it's so engaging, and he has this wonderful weathered face from all his years in the sun, skiing probably, and the mountains and that kind of mountain winter sun. So very wrinkly. He was very tall, 6'2", I think.
Very imposing person.
Yeah, and these kind of sparkly blue eyes. You know, people called him Pan. He had a kind of aura about him of the spiritual, the psychical, as he would probably call it.
Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes left. Oh, whoa. I think Eleanor had her hand up just ahead of Millie. So Eleanor, please unmute.
Sorry, Millie. I was just going to ask, I guess, a bit of a light question, but I wondered if in the process of researching, because I know that you are a long-time Blackwood fan, but in the process of searching for this particular volume, did you find anything that surprised you about Blackwood or about his works?
Good question. I discovered more non-fiction pieces than I expected to. What I mean, you talked earlier about if I discovered any lost stories in the newspaper archives. I didn't find any stories, but I did find some essays, articles, book reviews he wrote that no one knows about, I think, except for me. Hopefully they can see the light of day somewhere. And that came up in the process, but they didn't fit into the kind of categories that we had chosen for this book. So, I mean, I think just that there is more material out there. I think there's even a chance that there are more stories out there. And I think that's the kind of wonderful aspect of doing this kind of research with someone like Blackwood. It's not research I'm particularly used to. My PhD work was not sort of archival based, more interpretive. So it's been a wonderful experience for me going back to this work. I mean, for this book, I also went back to the British Library and went through his letters, his Macmillan letters that are held there. I did that for the PhD, but I didn't keep very good notes, so I decided to go back and trawl through those again. And there's so many fascinating details, things that I hadn't picked up on the first time, that with kind of a few more years of thinking about Blackwood and reading more of his material, it really struck a kind of different chord, his approach. I mean, he talks about, for example, being in Austria when it was annexed by Nazi Germany, for example, and things like that, and how he detests the Nazi system, but he doesn't think there's going to be war. And then, of course, he was wrong. And things like that, you know, these kinds of interesting little historical moments, his time in the Blitz, for example. So one of the interesting collections the British Library has is a series of letters, correspondence rather, between Blackwood and another writer, a fan, and she's trying to write works in a kind of similar vein to Blackwood, and he reads a story and he writes kind of notes for her saying, oh, you shouldn't really do this, or you should do it a bit like this. And that's
what was
really
the name of the writer?
I can't remember. I'd have to look at my notes.
Oh, good. Yeah, I'd like to know.
I'll let you know. Yeah. I mean, so there's more out there. I think that's what's most surprising about Blackwood. I mean, because there's no kind of dedicated society. You think of something like the Friends of Arthur Machen, for example, Ghosts and Scholars, the M.R. James. I mean, these writers have substantial interest for a long time. Blackwood's sort of been a little bit forgotten, which is bizarre because he was by far the most famous when he died. He was a household name at the time of his death. And now he's been forgotten. So this book is my small contribution to bringing him back.
Yeah. And Mike Ashley's collection for British Library Publishing, that's recently out. I read a review of it in the British Science Fiction Review. So that's out as well. Millie, have you got your question still?
I'm glad to find other Blackwood fans. I'm
Yeah.
currently writing my thesis, and one of my chapters looks at his more well-known supernatural fiction. So I'm bringing the Willows and the Wendigo together with a few other bits and pieces. And I'm kind of interested in the way his social dynamics work, like the way he brings people together, often in quite sort of far out landscapes. And it's really interesting to hear you talk about hearing his own voice in the work, because I think you and I very much are on the same page there. It's kind of difficult to tease out the bits which are the narrator and the bits that feel like Blackwood talking. But I'm interested a little bit about if you know much about the people he was mixing with, who his social circles were, whether we feel them integrated into his stories at all in a similar sort of way.
Yeah, partially. I don't think he writes people he knows into fiction, except for in very kind of odd ways. I'm thinking of a story like The Old Man of Visions from his first collection that's based on Alfred Louis, who's a kind of mystic mentor figure that he has in New York. And he dedicates his autobiography to him, and he says that he's the kind of base of that character, similar with Mayday Eve, I think, as well. He tends not to include people he knows, though. He's not that kind of writer. Which isn't to say that I mean, he wrote over 200 stories, so there's guaranteed to be certain pictures. I think Ashley talks about a story like, is it Malahide and Forden? This is really testing me now. This is a more obscure story, but I think it's based on two actor friends that Blackwood knew in London and that sort of thing. So there are kind of elements. I mean, he is autobiographical, so he's writing about his experiences, people he meets. His books are dedicated to people he knows. They do turn up. I mean, Maya, Mabel, his kind of muse. She, I think, is a character in the Clairvoyance, in Pan's Garden, for example, thinly disguised. So yeah, in fact, the more I think about it, the more these people do sort of come into the stories. But he's not a writer that's trying to caricature anyone or anything like that. I don't think. He's taking aspects of people, usually people that share the same wavelength as him, and turning them into kind of avatars for his ideas, if that makes sense. In terms of his wider just social friends, I mean, he kind of knew everyone. That kind of 6 degrees of separation, I'm sure, with Blackwood would be fascinating, because, you know, his father was Sir. He was knighted in 1887 or 8. His mother's first husband was the Duke of Manchester. So he moves in aristocratic circles, essentially. And then goes to New York, and he's living in poverty, and he goes to kind of dive bars, and he lives that whole kind of life of being down and out, really. And then everything in between. He moves with all the writers. I don't think I posted something on Twitter the other day about him going to Arthur Machen's 80th birthday party, and they're all there, and he's kind of, you know, he's also a member of the Savile Club, which he joined in 1908, which is, you know, kind of gentleman's club, and that's just teeming with all the authors there. Henry James, H.G. Wells, M.R. James is a member, I think from earlier, Rudyard Kipling. I mean, just loads. So, I mean, even if he didn't meet all of these people, he must have met some of them. And he certainly has a correspondence with H.G. Wells later in life. So yeah, a real mix. And you see that in all his kinds of stories, from meeting kind of really upper class people. A story like a Mayfair Luncheon, which is one of the more obscure stories, but it's in Ashley's new The Whisperers, which is just about a lunch at Mayfair with all these kind of hoity-toity, and then the character sees, or Jesus comes and sits next to him, and he kind of has this conversation with Jesus. It's all one of his kind of short mystical stories. But yeah, I've kind of gone on a tangent here, but I hope that kind of semi-answers your question.
I've remembered why there hasn't been much published. There haven't been many Blackwood publications recently, is because he's only just come out of copyright, and the rights for Blackwood are really expensive. So when we republished The Willows 2 years ago in our British Weird anthology, that was the most expensive permission fee we had to pay out of the 2 or 3 that we're still in copyright. But now this is why I wanted to do a Blackwood anthology, because he was just out this year.
Yeah, it
Or
was
last
perfect.
year, actually, it was last year. Yeah. So that's also why the British Library have done it. We have a question or a remark from Deborah. If you could choose one story to introduce people to Blackwood's work, which one would you choose? And which is your favourite story?
God, good
Always a
question.
killer question.
I think in terms of one story would be The Willows. I think it just is his best short story. And his short stories are better than his non-fiction. So I think that's probably his best piece of writing. He thought so too. Piece of writing, he thought so too. My favourite story is a difficult question. Some of the more unusual ones that I really like are The Price of Wiggins's Orgy, which is a kind of black comedy about a cannibal club in London, and Wiggins has made some money and he goes to dine at this fancy restaurant, not realizing that after hours it turns into a cannibal club, and they're gonna, eat him and stuff. So that's really good. The Strange Disappearance of a Baronet, another really good story, where a kind of very vain man who thinks he's kind of everything and that everyone should sort of bow to him and grovel, and he's a baronet, is treated really poorly at this hotel he's staying at, and gradually he kind of starts to shrink and becomes insignificant. And this is kind of like literal. He literally gets smaller, and everything becomes really embarrassing for him. And it's sort of about, just because you're a baronet doesn't mean you actually are anything. You're kind of empty. And so he kind of shrinks down to the size that he, and it's a kind of another one of he kind of wakes up at the end and he's on the train kind of thing. A kind of mystical story, but really, really good one nonetheless. I think probably my favorite of his more substantial novellas is a story called The Damned. And Blackwood, there's an unpublished letter from Blackwood where he says that the two best stories are The Willows and The Wendigo, and he says, and to that I would add a third, The Damned. And it's a story that not many people have read. It's published in Incredible Adventures, 1918. It's a kind of haunted house story in which nothing really happens. I can't really explain it, except that those are the words that keep cropping up in the story. Blackwood says, yeah, and nothing happened, yet nothing happened, and yet everything seems to happen. It is the most atmospheric story of his, really kind of just grim. It's kind of about a strong and now deceased religious figure. And it's going back to Blackwood's youth and childhood and these sorts of things, who's created a very difficult, horrible vibe in this house, which is called the Towers. It's this kind of sprawling mansion. And he goes to stay there, this character, with his sister, I think. And another woman that's staying there starts kind of almost being possessed by this energy of vitriol that's been left behind. And it's very sinister. It's got these kind of religious overtones. There's some wonderful sequences in it, descriptive sequences of Blackwood trying to explain this feeling without anything happening. Like nothing tangible is happening, and yet it's still there. It's wonderfully, wonderfully written. The only drawback is, and I think the reason why it's not as well known as it is the ending, which I won't spoil, but I think most people find it disappointing. I'll put it that way. Yeah.
I think that's a terrific way to end the launch, the session, the talk. Thank you very much, Henry. Could you all unmute and applaud our speaker who's done really, really well? Thank you.
Excellent.
Very
Thank you for
good.
coming.
Thank you.
And enjoy the book.
Want to see more from us? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to click like, subscribe, or new content alert.